Well, welcome back to the series of African political thought. Today we'll be looking at South Africa, we'll be looking at Nelson Mandela, and we'll be looking in particular at Thabo Mbeki, particularly insofar as he has a direct relationship to the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism. In more recent times, he's been the only African leader really to try to put back onto the map the idea of an African Renaissance, meaning that in terms of cultural linkages, that will take the entire continent forward. Very, very bold statements, not so much in terms of very bold movements. It remained to a certain extent a rhetoric. But we'll come to that. What we did at the end of last week's discussion was to talk about the terrible racism that existed in white Rhodesia in the days before it became independent, majority-ruled Zimbabwe. If, however, the white Rhodesians were racist, then there was a certain inspiration, a certain model that they wished to follow without actually legislating it as heavily as happened in South Africa. But it was indeed the South African apartheid model of separations, of so-called separate development. Only black development would always be at a slightly lower pace and at a lower quality than white development. But the social segregation was such that maybe I can illustrate that by beginning with a lecture. Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and the majority rule elections after 4 years of negotiation took place in 1994. It was only then that he became president of South Africa. Those years of negotiation were extremely difficult ones, and I was in South Africa for part of that time, basically watching the ANC negotiators learn by making mistakes. And I think that's one of the first things that one has got to realize, and that is, if you spend 27 years in prison, this does not exactly give you training to become a great president, and it doesn't give you training to become a great negotiator. So a fairly stiff hill to climb, learning on the job, as it were, and learning to gain the respect of those against whom you were negotiating. So this story begins in 1984. The South Africans were just then embarking on a twin-track strategy towards the region. One of those was militarized, very heavily militarized, and it was called total strategy. It was modeled on the French efforts to smother insurrection campaigns for independence in Algeria. The French mastermind of that was a General André Balfour, and the South African High Command were quite determined, by all means possible, thus the name Total Strategy, to crush any possibility of the surrounding Southern African states supporting the ANC. Now, this meant, of course, all kinds of problems for the surrounding states, who were all destabilized in different ways, and I've written about this, setting out the different military and other coercive tactics used country by country. But they had a certain problem in terms of Zambia in particular, because they didn't want to crush Zambia because, among other things, the very good public relations internationally that Kenneth Kaunda had built up, but also because the ANC in exile was headquartered there in Lusaka. And if reduce Lusaka to rubble, with whom would the South African government eventually negotiate? So the twin track of 1984 was very, very much militarized, total strategy, but also begin negotiations, but in a clandestine way, using at first what is called track 2 diplomacy. In other words, you don't send official people, but you send people who are so closely connected to track 1 or official diplomacy that in fact the descriptor track 2 in this case is probably not quite correct, probably far more like track 1.5 or even track 1.25, track 1.25. So in 1984, these negotiations began with the full knowledge of the South African government and of the Zambian government and of the ANC, with the full knowledge of Thabo Mbeki, as well as Kenneth Kaunda, of course. And it was a two-person delegation. One was Vandermeer, who was a noted mediator in the township wars of urban South Africa, a Quaker, a man of peace who had won the trust of Kenneth Kaunda, so he had bona fides. His companion was Piet Mula. Piet was the editor of De Beeld, the most right-wing newspaper in South Africa, very, very much an apartheid-supporting newspaper. And he was very closely related, blood ties with the South African establishment. He was related to Ampi Mula, for instance, who was a very senior ministerial figure in the apartheid government. So these two were coming to begin off-the-record, clandestine, never to be revealed discussions with the ANC. Of course, they were revealed. South Africa's Aliki Siv, and Piet was, after all, a newspaper editor, so he was the one who first spilt the beans. But the day before they came, I received a phone call from London. I was working at the University of Zambia. The only telephones in the entire university were in the Vice-Chancellor's office. I received a breathless messenger who had run from the Vice-Chancellor's office. I had selected the highest office in the University of Zambia, just so people wouldn't come and bother me. So he was racing up the steps and said, there's a phone call for you from London. So I raced down to the Vice-Chancellor's office, and the message was, look, these two are coming to Lusaka, and they're scared shitless. Now, those were the words that were used. Before they see the ANC for their first meeting, could you do the icebreaker and have them for dinner, put them at ease? Now, in fact, Vandermeer was not scared shitless. Piet Mula certainly was. I agreed to do this, but it was problematic. Half the time we had no electricity and no running water. So would I be able to make dinner at all? But I invited two of my finest students also to be at dinner. One went on to take a doctorate at Oxford and is now teaching at London School of Economics, for instance. And they knew immediately what was going on and what they had to do. So the electricity held, the water held. Piet and Harvey had, I think, a reasonable meal. And afterwards, the students left, and I was washing the dishes. I said to my guests, I better do that now while the water lasts. And Piet Mula came running up to me and said, Stephen, that was amazing. And I said, what? And he said, I've never dined in the company of black people before. So on my part, there was a deep intake of breath, and I realized that negotiations might well continue. And indeed they did in a track 2 format for quite some years, before finally, towards the end of the 1980s, they were taken over on a direct track 1 basis involving Thabo Mbeki directly with the leaders of apartheid South Africa. But track 2 up to that point in time. But I remember thinking there's going to be a long way to go. And we were putting up with commando raids, bombing raids in Lusaka throughout this entire period. But the idea of never having dined before in black company seemed in some ways both illustrative as well as shocking. So those were the first negotiations to begin really talks about eventually releasing Nelson Mandela. It actually took military defeat, the defeat of the South African army by a Cuban army at the Battle of Quito Carnavale in 1988, for the South Africans to change their leadership. F.W. de Klerk became the leader of the South African government, and he opened negotiations with Kenneth Kaunda. I was there at the time, although not part of these negotiations, but very much in touch with Kaunda's advisors. And Kaunda basically said, you've got to release Mandela. And that was in 1989, these talks, and in early 1990, Mandela was released. And I've been to the spot where he was released. One of my friends was one of the ANC guards who escorted him out of prison. That only began 4 years of, as I said, very, very difficult negotiations in which the idea of a rainbow nation was something which formed in a parallel process. In other words, what am I going to do if these negotiations finally succeed and there's a majority rule government to make it an inclusive government? If we start tearing this country apart, then all of the gains that we hoped for in terms of freedom and majority rule would be eroded, if not destroyed. But if race relations were as backward as in the story with which I began at this lecture, then Mandela also knew there was going to be a long road upwards and hopefully forwards. We'll come to all of that. Mandela had spent 27 years in prison, of course, and this was after he had been charged with treason at the Rivonia trials. Not just him, but a number of other people, including the father of Thabo Mbeki, Govan Mbeki. Govan, in the words of Moletsi Mbeki, Thabo's brother, as we had lunch in London one day, was a man who was committed to two iconic figures and their teachings. One was Karl Marx and the other one was Gandhi. The only person missing from the portraits on the mantelpiece was, of course, Sigmund Freud. It actually took Frantz Fanon to introduce Freud in his Lacanian form to discourse on liberation. But the idea that you could have an achieved revolution that was not necessarily violent was belied by the fact that the ANC in its fledgling form had planned for violence. So there was some substance in the accusations leveled against Mandela, in particular at the Rivonia treason trial. He had actually gone to Ethiopia and received training from the officers of Haile Selassie in sabotage, what we would call terrorism today. He himself never did sabotage anything, but he had training. In other words, this was an option from the very early days for the ANC. Later, Thabo Mbeki himself received such training. He was the one who taught Jacob Zuma how to use a machine gun. And in fact, he received his own training in the Soviet Union. A Cold War, as it were, series of alliances ran parallel with the struggle for majority rule, the struggle for Mandela's release. And in fact, it's only just now closed down, but there was a spot on the left bank, not far from the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a small cafe called La Palette, and the ANC, people being sent out of South Africa to the Soviet Union for training, were given instructions simply to sit at La Palette, sometimes for days on end. They were being spied upon by Soviet agents who were very anxious to ensure that they were not also being spied upon by apartheid agents. And when the Soviets were convinced that all was clear, then the contact was made, the pickup was made, and these people would be escorted to Moscow for their training. Not very efficacious in terms of actual effect in the field. There never really was an armed insurrection in South Africa. Some sabotage, to be sure, but let us say there was not a military campaign that one would recognize as a military campaign, as there was in Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe. Even so, there was enough, as it were, intention in the early days for treason trial to proceed on the basis of realistic charges. And it was Thabo Mbeki who, here as a student in Great Britain, he'd left South Africa in 1962. The Rivonia treason trial was in 1964. The death sentence, after the defendants were found guilty, was being widely canvassed and discussed in South Africa. And it was Thabo, on behalf of both Mandela and his own father, Govan Mbeki, who campaigned successfully as a student for the British government to intervene, saying, look, just sentence these people to life imprisonment. Don't kill them. That would cause you in the long term more trouble than you might think it's worth. And so the long prison sentences were handed down. And then the question, of course, is asked, how on earth did someone like Mandela on Robben Island for the most part of his prison sentence, how did he build up an international movement, or how did he come to be regarded as the leader of an international movement? Because although there wasn't a militarized campaign in the full-fledged sense, all the same there was a huge international campaign to end apartheid and to free Mandela. He personified the campaign. He was the icon that people rallied around. So how did he do it? Well, it was really quite incredible. One day when it was all over, I was in Italy, Lake Como. This might sound very palatial, and indeed it was, but Konrad Adenauer, the post-war German chancellor, had a holiday house in Lake Como. And after his death, his estate basically devoted it to international diplomacy of a confidential nature. No one knows what is meant to happen in this Konrad Adenauer retreat in Italy. It's basically where solutions are sought before they're then taken to more formal negotiations. And everyone thinks they're negotiating hard at these formal sessions. In fact, the decision's already been taken in informal fashion. But I was there with, among others, Terra Lekota, Moisia Lekota, who had also been in prison in Robben Island with Mandela, with Govan Mbeki. And our plane out was going to be late, some hours late, and everyone was chafing. So in the early morning, I ordered wine. And the waiters knew what to do. You only had to look at them and they would bring more bottles of wine. And wine is the great inducer at diplomatic occasions for compromise to be made and for confidences to be revealed. So I asked Terra, and he got his name because of his prowess on the football field, not because he was himself a great terrorist. I asked him, well, how did you guys do it? You were meant to be in segregated blocks in the prison on Robben Island. How did you communicate with each other, let alone communicate with the outside world? And he began talking. And he said it was Mandela who worked out that all of the separated, segregated blocks of the prison were connected by the same plumbing. And they used Morse code, tapping on the pipes to communicate with one another in separate blocks. So always there was a sense of unity, even in prison, even though separated. And then Terra said, and how did we get our messages that we had agreed upon through this means to the outside world? And he said, again, this was from Mandela, he absolutely instructed us all to be utterly polite at all times to the guards, the white guards, even when they were being maltreated by these white guards. Mandela, in fact, tells stories of some of these white guards pissing all over him, for instance, as almost a ritual of denigration. Look how far below us you are. But Mandela always was polite in return, instructed everyone to be polite in the face of grave provocation. And it took years. But apparently, according to Terra Lekota, some of the guards began to repent their ways, and even to recognize that they were dealing with people who, in dignity at least, were in fact not just the equal of themselves, but superior. So they began carrying messages to the outside world, secretly. The ANC arranged pick-up points. Mandela's first and youngest Minister of Security after majority rule came, Sidney Bufamadi, he was my PhD student, he was in charge of the underground liaison that carried the messages from literally the dock side, where they would be handed the messages or given a garbled version of the message by the jailers, and Sidney would arrange for the transport of these messages through a complex network to the outside world, where the resistance internationally was led by Thabo Mbeki, a frequent visitor to Lusaka, but really a global traveler, a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and as I said, the Soviet Union, but very active also in Western countries. So part of his cosmopolitan nature is very much derived from the fact that he led a very cosmopolitan life out of necessity. But what it also meant was that if he left South Africa to go to the University of Sussex as a student, where he took a master's degree as well as his undergraduate degree, both in development economics, if he began his studies in 1962, having left South Africa then, and he didn't return until just after the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, this meant that he had spent more years outside South Africa than he had spent in it on his return. And when he became president after Nelson Mandela, even with those added years, he had still spent more time not being, as it were, physically a South African as growing up in South Africa and having a brief 5 years back before he became president of a country, to put it bluntly, that he scarcely knew. Nor did Mandela himself know the ANC. He might have got messages out, but it was Mbeki who had to introduce him to the huge exile movement that had grown up. It had to be people like Sidney Bufamadi who introduced him to the huge underground Inzao movement that had run liaison between inside and outside. So if Mbeki was a stranger to his country, and this has an effect on his African Renaissance, it had to be a pan-African Renaissance, including the black world outside Africa, because in some ways Mbeki knew that better than he knew Africa, certainly South Africa. If it was going to be, as it were, this kind of becoming accustomed to your own comrades, to your own country, it actually spoke to some artificiality in the early days in which the Rainbow Bridge pioneered by Mandela was a necessity. There had to be unity simply to develop familiarity, not just in racial terms, overcoming racial stereotypes, but also in terms of developing some kind of unity that could pass for a government, that could turn a divided ANC, prisoners, combatants, exiles, into a unified party. It was an uneasy mix. In a way, it was good that there were 4 years of negotiation, because it gave the ANC some time to come together. And of course, one of the first things the majority rule government did after winning a sweeping electoral victory in 1994 was to ponder, well, how do we do things now? And two things. One of them resulted from what are called the Brenthurst fireside chats, in which basically Mandela was persuaded that a capitalist system would remain in South Africa, that the big corporations would remain, and in fact the Brenthurst estate was run by the Oppenheimer family, who at that point in time were the senior figures in De Beers, the mining company, for instance. And they persuaded Mandela, who actually didn't need that much persuasion, in the debates in the universities of the cells on Robben Island. He'd always taken this position. It was Governor Mbeki who took the more Marxist position. But the Mandela position was always, look, we've got to make the transition with as little disruption as possible. Disruption would only mean that our people would have to wait even longer for benefits. So the great corporations were to stay as a result of these fireside chats, the Brenthurst fireside chats. The other thing, of course, was the instigation with a lot of the moral, as it were, animation of Bishop Desmond Tutu of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, if you in public confess to even sometimes terrible crimes committed in the name of apartheid, murdering people, being assassins, you could be forgiven in the name of A, you had admitted your crimes and repented them, and B, you were prepared to be part of a new South Africa. The Rainbow Bridge was built on, some might call it a huge moral vision, some might say a moral compromise. You can take this as you wish to see it. One of the key commissioners, Albie Sachs, who basically was disfigured, maimed for life as a result of an assassin's attack. I remember seeing the photographs in the newspapers the day after it happened, where he'd been blinded and one arm blown off, and he was lying in the street, screaming for help, waving a stump, what had been his arm, begging for help, which did come. The assassin had botched it, and years later the assassin came to introduce himself and asked forgiveness. And Albie Sachs basically made almost, as it were, a lecture circuit story out of this. His name was Henry. Albie forgave Henry. And this was meant to set the tone, the demeanor, the ethos of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So if the apartheid white South Africans had to come a long way from the expression of Piet Muller, whom I went to visit after Mandela's release, if Piet Muller and his comrades had to come a long way, then probably the longest steps were taken by Mandela, Tutu, and the ANC. Did it work? Well, basically, as I said, if you spend 27 years in prison, you don't know how to run a country. The vice president, Thabo Mbeki, did most of that work. And Thabo Mbeki, as I said, had spent more years outside the country than inside it. He'd been greatly influenced at Sussex by the Institute of Development Studies, established by two people, Dudley Sears and Hans Singer. Hans, in fact, was my own mentor. He would come up to the Commonwealth Secretariat and very patiently guide me through what I was meant to be doing, holding down for some time the so-called social development desk, which was me alone, and just pointing out in the most gentle, well, fatherly, I guess, but he adopted an older brother tone as to where on earth it was that I should be going, and how on earth could I be screwing up as badly as I was. It was an incredibly kind and formative experience for me. That kind of tuition basically gave to someone like Thabo Mbeki not only a deep knowledge of international economics expressed in a neo-Marxist sense about local leading to global accumulation, but it also drilled into him his own sense of decency. You've got to take people forward step by step, but all the same, at some point in time, and it was almost as if he couldn't wait to become president after Mandela, he quite ruthlessly sidelined his rivals who also had visions of themselves having the succession. They never forgave him, which is why they sided with Jacob Zuma afterwards when finally Zuma won an internal power struggle and the ANC and deposed Mbeki. But basically, albeit with ruthlessness, he became president of South Africa and embarked upon a program of economic reform. Now, if you're going to have a capitalist country with great corporations there, while having a neo-Marxist sense of the moral rectitude of redistribution, then you've got to grow economically. And you've got to grow, our estimate was, by at least 6% a year. It was impossible. 3.6 was, I think, the highest point in growth, and sometimes well under that. And the vast, as it were, efforts and visions on the part of the ANC were never realized, with great dissatisfaction to this day. At the same time, the expectation that the government would provide and the huge gap between a local person and a huge corporate magnate, such a huge gap, meant that those at the bottom were not very adept in modern startups. They didn't have the sense they could or even should compete. And with what means could they compete? The whole country was extremely slow, remains extremely slow in terms of being wired up electronically, for instance. The ANC is to a certain extent to blame for that. For years, almost none of the ministers in cabinet after cabinet, whether Mandela's or Mbeki's or Zuma's, actually knew how to use the internet. So it was actually a travesty of modern development, almost as if history stopped and didn't need to be restarted after the great battle for majority rule had been won. But it meant that the technocratic programs that Mbeki tried to put into the field were extremely difficult to enact. And they carried over the legislation and the regulatory framework of the ANC, of the national government before the ANC became the government, the apartheid methodologies of government. So when I made a tour of township slum schools in the early days, giving lectures at these places to the students, noting the huge discrepancy in terms of some schools that had benefits and some schools that had almost none. You'd race off immediately afterwards to the nearest bookshop and buy them a library. It was that kind of powerlessness in terms of educational provision. But talking to headmasters and saying, look, why doesn't the government give you more money? This is a poor school. And he said, underneath the old legislation, which the ANC hasn't changed, if you were within 1 kilometre of a tarred road, you couldn't be regarded as a poor school. You had a tarred road, 1 kilometre, close to you. And I said, I came here in a 4-wheel drive, bumping over dirt roads. And he said, yes, but in order to get to those dirt roads, you had to come on the freeway, the great flyover that you see overhead. Because that great motorway flyover is within 1 kilometre's distance of this school, we are technically an advanced school. And for years, that kind of legislation, that kind of regulatory framework was never changed. So learning the methodologies and the arts of government were difficult. So that tried to enact with a whole new staff cadre in many cases. In other words, you had to majority rule the ministries as well. You couldn't have a government that was a majority government and a civil service that was not, at least attempting to be a majority civil service. It meant a lot of people learning difficult things ineptly, without proper support, without a proper regulatory transformation, and without modern communications. So trying to develop the economy depended a lot on, let us say, this compromise between the need to redistribute and the need to keep the great corporations on side as the wealth generators. And Mbeki, despite his own economic training, relied a lot on Trevor Manuel as his Minister of Finance or Minister of Economic Planning. And what they tried to do was to instigate black empowerment programs, modeled really on United States programs of black empowerment, where on a preferential basis, contracts, particularly government contracts, would be given to black companies and black startups. The only problem is that many of these black startups started up precisely to take advantage of being able to tender for government contracts, didn't know what they were doing. So that a very great deal of the housing units that had been part of the ANC manifesto since 1955, that the Congress of the People in Kliptown, Soweto, the beginning of the organized fight back against apartheid, many of the housing units were built by black empowerment companies, broad-based black economic empowerment companies that were inept in terms of what they were doing. Come across entire estates with new housing units with toilets in them, and several miles away was the nearest sewage pipe. So joined up planning, joined up execution of plans was difficult, and a lot of sloppiness. In other words, you tender at the lowest possible prices so you could win the government contract. But I used to work my way through university myself as a young person. I know how to do plastering, and I could tour some of these new estates and basically predict when I come back here 2 years' time, all of that plaster will have fallen off that wall. It's so badly mixed, there's so little, as it were, binding constituents in that, and sure enough, 2 years later, it was falling off. So a lot of disillusionment with the promise, the rollout of the promise, the inept execution of the promise, which is probably why someone with a populist agenda, but again, not a technocratic agenda like Jacob Zuma, was able to take advantage of discontent with someone who was seen as an elite leader like Thabo Mbeki, who didn't really understand his own people. And certainly in terms of the weekly newsletters that the leader of the ANC, that was also Mbeki, president of the ANC as well as president of the country, he would write these newsletters which were really like literary essays. He would be discoursing on poetry. He would be discoursing on historical figures, on African figures from other countries who were unknown in South Africa. And basically, insofar as he was talking about poetry, he could have been writing like a professor rather than as a political leader. So there were problems in terms of communication, problems in terms of imagery, and problems in terms of the execution of his economic policies. Broad-based black economic empowerment really wasn't a huge success. And the promises made to deliver what they called service delivery with an inept public administrative system, often using antique regulatory frameworks, also didn't really succeed. The rate of growth, the percentage of growth, never reached the levels it was meant to reach. The big corporations entrenched themselves. The struggle against the big corporations were led by the trade union movements, who gradually came to see their former allies, the ANC, as much an enemy, or at least an impediment, as the corporations themselves. All the same, what was hung over from the Mandela years, the rainbow years, was this very loose philosophy called Ubuntu, which is never articulated in rigorous philosophical terms. It's a very loose ethic. It's an Nguni concept, and essentially means we're all in this together. Oneself is another, otherwise no one is able to go forward. No individual goes forward except if the society goes forward. So the means of making society going forward using Ubuntu was A, non-violent. You couldn't be coercive beyond a certain extent. It had to be cooperative, and everyone had to go forward together, and in this case black and white, and all of those in between. And don't forget, those in between had a pretty rough time too. The Asian population, the Chinese population, the colored population. So that being able to forge a unity was, let us say, a multifaceted task. All the same, when you're trying to apply Ubuntu to economic policy, it probably explains the need to have a broad-based black economic empowerment. Let's take a whole class of previously deprived entrepreneurs forward. But if you don't facilitate this, then there's no technocratic input to what you're trying to do. So just as last week I labored a critique of Mugabe's lack of technocratic planning when it came to agricultural production, then in terms of urban-based production, which is what broad-based black economic empowerment was meant to do, There was also no real technocratic inputs at a certain level, at the micro level, where the work was actually meant to be done by the newly formed startups that were meant to bid for government contracts. So it sounded great. It was also, however, a problematic concept in terms of international relations, particularly regional relations. After Mugabe stole, rigged the 2008 elections in Zimbabwe, it was basically Mbeki on behalf of the Southern African Development Community, all of the countries of the region, who tortuously over months hammered out the compromise whereby Mugabe, who should have lost those elections, remained president, and an invented position of prime minister was given to the leader of the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai. Very difficult, very fractious relationship. An opposition minister of finance stabilized the economy, which has run amok again now. And that technocratic input was made possible only by the adoption of the American dollar. In other words, the technocracy was simply using someone else's currency that had value. But what it meant was that in forcing through, making everybody finally sign up to a coalition government, Mbeki was putting on the table, for diplomatic purposes, a version of Ubuntu, which he had already tried out in Democratic Republic of Congo to a certain temporary success. He would afterwards try to apply it to Darfur, to much less success. It seemed to be a holding action, that as a holding action was successful for a short time in Zimbabwe, the stabilization of the economy, albeit by using US currency, has to be counted as a temporary success. And it is a success also for Ubuntu, that is inclusiveness, which means that if you can do away with opposition politics in a time of emergency, this is not new. There have been coalition governments in times of war in this country, for instance, and elsewhere. But basically, togetherness is a principle. Ubuntu is a principle in which inclusiveness is a greater value than democracy. Now, I'm stating it at its most stark, at its most blunt. I've said this in South Africa on many occasions. What was achieved in South Africa's use of Ubuntu in Zimbabwe, very similar to what Kofi Annan achieved after the 2007 elections in Kenya. It's a compromise which you dignified by a value which is loosely expressed as togetherness. Unity and togetherness is more important than democratic choice. Now, you can't say this out loud in terms of the South African Constitution, which was one of those things that took 4 years to negotiate after Mandela's release. The most progressive constitution on earth. Every equality is there. Not just racial equality, but gender equality, sexual preference equality, the whole lot. It's got the greatest list of equalities that you could possibly contemplate. It remains. It was then, it is now, the most progressive constitution on earth. But what it means is that you have in that constitution, therefore, an expression of Ubuntu, but at the same time you have in a constitution an expression of rights. And those rights include democratic choice. So you have, as it were, a clash there of values, democracy and inclusiveness. In the case of Zimbabwe, one was prioritized over the other. Perhaps there was no choice. Perhaps it was, as it were, an enforced application of an ethic, which all the same is used very, very loosely, and which has never actually been defined beyond its loose usage. There are analogous terms in many other African languages. As I said, it's an Nguni term in this particular case. Similar sounding terms, but with similar meanings, expressed in many other languages of the region. But it meant that you had something which was carried over from Mandela into the Mbeki administration. He might have been able to force it through in terms of regional politics. He certainly was not able to convince someone like Tony Blair about the value of it, for instance. So that when Blair basically pulled off a diplomatic blinder in terms of marginalizing Mbeki at a Commonwealth meeting, Mbeki was seeking to have no Commonwealth sanctions imposed upon Zimbabwe despite what was happening in Zimbabwe. He thought this would just get in the way of this mediation there, but Blair basically blindsided him and did so in a very curious way. And Mbeki was sure that all of Black Africa, many Commonwealth members of Black Africa, would support his position. In fact, Blair detached both Ghana and Kenya and basically secured the support of all of the Black Caribbean countries and the Pacific countries, the majority of the Commonwealth outside of Africa. Mbeki was furious and stormed back to South Africa and penned one of his most polemical but most interesting weekly newsletters to the ANC, again using a tone, using a language that very few people would have been able to understand, but referencing the work of the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And Ngugi's great essay, Decolonizing the Mind, was about how one has got to lose the contamination of thought processes, linguistic processes that had been part of the legacy of the colonial and the metropolitan powers. Really the formative essay of the whole decolonial movement, which is reaching, as it were, new heights today, but still without the definitions that it lacked, even way back then. But Mbeki said, look, we've got to lose this kind of heritage, this way of thinking that we gained from the colonial powers. Africa has got to stand up for itself, or Pan-Africa has got to stand up for itself. It's got to speak for itself in a language of its own. Now, Ngugi basically meant this in literal terms from the moment he wrote his great essay, which actually began as the Douglas Robb Lectures at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, of all places. I helped my friends organize that, those who had stayed behind at the university in Auckland. Basically, from the time of his declaration of decolonizing the mind, Ngugi published his work only in Kikuyu, his own native language. He wouldn't write in English anymore, despite the fact that he had several prize-winning books that he had written earlier in English. Great books, in fact, and it's a travesty that he has never been awarded the Nobel Literature Prize. Now, Mbeki didn't mean it in those literal terms, but he meant it in terms of being at least able to think one's way forward in terms of an autonomous nationalism and an autonomous internationalism. And in terms of an autonomous nationalism, this basically speaks to the essential sympathy that he had for Robert Mugabe. So I'm linking now with last week's lecture. Why was he so easy on Mugabe when he was breaking all kinds of constitutional ethics? But he was basically doing them on behalf of an autonomous nationalism, no matter if conceived, as I said last week, in a shallow fashion. And he was doing it on behalf of an ethic, an Ubuntu ethic, which Mugabe wouldn't have used in so many words. There is a Shona version of Ubuntu, but Mugabe was a far more ruthless person than perhaps Mbeki could be, even on his most hard man days, and he had those as well. It meant, however, that you had the application of a certain thought, a lineage, which most people don't really see between Mandela and Mbeki. Everyone sees Mandela as the moral person and Mbeki as the technocrat. In fact, there's a linking vision, there are linking thought there. Of course, Mbeki borrowed from other people, including the social democratic thought of the Labour Party, the Fabian Society here. It wasn't just Kenneth Kaunda, who was greatly influenced by people like Tony, the idea of a moral economy, but really the idea of a moral economy, an inclusiveness, an autonomous nationalism, and an autonomous internationalism that would bind all black people together. And here he's speaking once again to the fact that most of his years before he became president were spent outside of South Africa. He wrote about the black poets of the Caribbean. They would have meant nothing to most South Africans. They meant a lot to Mbeki. He spoke about history again. Not many South Africans would have been aware of this history when Carthage waged war against Rome and Hannibal almost conquered the Roman armies and almost marched on Rome itself. Mbeki depicted this as what we would now call a Tunisian army, a Carthaginian army back then. He interpreted this as an African army. And he longed for a moment in the modern world where there would be this equality, where Africa could speak to itself autonomously because it was genuinely equal. In other words, he always carried with him, very idealistically, perhaps unrealistically, the idea of a Pan-Africa, an egalitarian and an equal Pan-Africa, egalitarian among all the different parts of Pan-Africa, including those who had never been to Africa itself, part of the black diaspora, as it were. He was the latter-day pioneer of the Pan-Africanism that we saw enunciated in the early days, such as at the 1945 Manchester Conference, the Pan-Africa Congress, in which the early nationalisms were beginning to find the first footsteps towards reality, but all the same anchored, even then, in a dream, a vision, an aspiration. And Mbeki also had that aspiration, even in his most hard-bitten moments as a beleaguered South African president. In some ways a very successful one. The economy has never functioned as well as under Mbeki, despite the fact it didn't function nearly as well as it needed to deliver the fruits that Mandela had in mind. And South Africa remains a deeply divided and stratified country. No longer stratified quite as much along racial lines, but certainly class lines, although defined in a very different way to the class lines of a Leninist analysis, because you can't take race out of it entirely. But anyway, stratified, a divided society in which the fruits of freedom have yet to come. Now, in making these observations about Mbeki as the last great Pan-Africanist, I should make a very slight amelioration, and that is if you are really going to find some sort of intellectual figure in the African diaspora, spent years in the diaspora outside of his native African country as well as time within Africa, then really the person one should look at is Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese writer, francophonic formation. He was professor at the Collège de France, the most elite institution in Paris, as an Egyptologist and as a nuclear physicist. A very, very rare achievement in both scientific and in terms of classical learning. And it was he who, writing in French, proposed the idea of a Pan-Africa as an aspiration, as the object of a renaissance, and as an object to which one could attach a philosophy. So the question one finally asks about Mbeki is that in his aspirations for a Pan-Africa, a diasporic as well as continental Ubuntu, was he able to attach a philosophy to this, or was it simply a rhetoric? Was it simply an aspiration? Well, probably it was just an aspiration. In all of his learned writings, Mbeki never really did try to develop the idea of a Pan-Africa and what it means. Could anyone? Don't forget, we began this lecture series by saying you've got 2,000 different languages, you've got a vast continent, You've got the diaspora outside of this vast continent. The diaspora has developed in so many different ways, so that the black condition in this country is not the same as the black condition in France. It's not the same as the black condition in the United States of America. It's not the same black condition as in Brazil. You've got, as it were, a binding sense of diaspora based on two things: a persecution and a discrimination, certainly, and the idea that somehow, in some form of solidarity, bespeaking a form of unity, things could be made better because this solidarity and unity will make you stronger. Mandela is probably the person who is going to be most closely associated with it. Mbeki tried to preach it. Diop wrote about it complexly, but all the same as a philosophical aspiration, rather than as a philosophy in any articulated form. Will we come to the African Renaissance? Well, we still have Mbeki on the scene. He's still mediating in international conflicts. He's still using the principle of inclusiveness. He's not being very successful. Will we see again the moral guiding lights that he, in a certain way, with an attempt at technocracy, encapsulated in a very definite moral way that Mandela personified? Will we see that again in an increasingly complex and volatile South Africa? Well, it remains to be seen. Not at the present moment, in any case. So, if you ask the basic concluding question of a lecture of this sort, what has been Mandela's effect? All these years of suffering on his part, all the rainbow bridge building that he tried to undertake, has it meant a South Africa that lives up to the dream of the 1955 Congress of the People in Kliptown, South Africa? Well, not quite. A valiant effort? Well, yes, in terms of how much it's overcome. I think back often to that exclamation on the part of Piet Muller in my kitchen in Lusaka, that he had never dined in the company of black people before. And they knew how to use their table manners. They knew how to sip the contraband wine I had smuggled in for the occasion. It helps when you've got friends in the embassies which couldn't buy the stuff in the supermarkets. And it was a perfect, normal dinner time with intelligent conversation. No one dropped their food all over their shirts or anything like that. And the idea of an inferiority, which necessarily was a corollary of oneself having a superiority, that was something that was terrible in South Africa. The worst edges of that have gone, not entirely, but to a large extent. Is that an accomplishment, the burial of apartheid, at least as a legislated and as a constitutional system? Yeah, that's a pretty big accomplishment of one of the great blights on the moral universe of humanity in the 20th century. So with those words, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a discussion about all of these things, and thank you for listening today.